This is an article that was published in the American Behavioral Scientist called Sense Making Under Holographic Conditions, Framing SCAD Research. Sense Making Under Holographic Conditions, Framing SCAD Research. SCAD, of course, meaning State Crimes Against Democracy. By Matthew Witt and Alexander Kuzmin. The glimpses of due diligence, reading the official account of 9/11 incident, continue being ignored by scholars of policy and public administration. This article introduces intellectual context for examining the policy heuristic, State Crimes Against Democracy, SCAD, which a term that was coined by DeHaven Smith in 2006, when these articles first started appearing in American Behavior Scientist, because I think this one is from 2010, and its usefulness for better understanding patterns of state criminality of which no extant policy analytic model gives adequate account. This article then introduces papers included in the symposium examining the chimerical presence and perfidious legacy of state criminality against democracy. It's copiously researched, copiously cited with many footnotes. And they open by quoting a senior Bush advisor who was quoted in the New York Times 2004. People like you, journalists, intellectuals, believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore. I got a cold. Sorry about that. I rarely get colds, but because of the change in weather here in Ecuador, I got a cold. I think this is Karl Rove that they're quoting. People like you, journalists, intellectuals, believe that solutions emerge from your judicious study of discernible reality. That's not the way the world really works anymore. We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, judiciously as you will act again, creating other new realities, which you can study too. And that's how things will sort out. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to just study what we do. Yeah, that was Karl Rove. And I don't know a more clear example of the idea that narratives are relative in this post-truth era. I mean, like older postmodern theorists would argue about whether we can describe certain events with certain adjectives. We just have the event, like tradition. We can't say that it's a great tradition. But now we're to the point where the event itself is called into question. Consider something that Adolf Hitler said. It would never come into the minds of the masses to fabricate colossal untruths, and they would not believe that others could have the impudence to distort the truth so infamously. Even though the facts which prove this too may be brought clearly to their minds, they will still doubt and waver. They will continue to think that there may be some other explanation. For the grossly impudent, it always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down. For the grossly impudent lie, it always leaves traces. A fact which is known to all expert liars in this world, and to all who conspire together in the art of lying. These people know only too well how to use falsehood for the basest purposes. And then William Faulkner, the past is never dead. It's not even past. This is an intense article. It's really great. We're looking at sense making under holographic conditions, framing SCAD research. from the American behavior scientist, and this article was 2010. Shock and awe, conspiracy or standard operating procedure. The prestige that the social sciences have managed to muster has depended heavily on behavioral measurement, grounded mostly on principles of observational and measurable methodologies. It is against this juggernaut methodological predilection that so-called conspiracy theorizing has been so mismeasured, derogated, ridiculed, and dismissed. Yet as 9/11 has shown, anyone paying attention, regardless of motives, modus operandi, or culpability of suspects, behavior that is observable is not always measurable, at least not straightforwardly so. Likewise, that which is measurable is very often not observed. Terrorists and sovereign states alike have long shared murky modus operandi. As William Blum, preeminent chronicler of U.S. military penetration across the globe, has commented, the de facto censorship that leaves so many Americans functionally illiterate about the history of the U.S. foreign affairs may be all the more effective because it is not so much official, heavy-handed, or conspiratorial as it is woven artlessly into the fabric of education and media. No conspiracy is needed. The editors of Reader's Digest and U.S. News and World Report do not need to meet covertly with the representatives from NBC in an FBI safe house to plan next month's stories and programs. For the simple truth is that these individuals will not have reached the positions they occupy if they themselves had not all been guided through the same tunnel of camouflage history and emerged with the same selective memory and conventional wisdom. And it's interesting because even the most critical of American foreign policy, Noam Chomsky, William Blum, Ward Churchill, they were unwilling to look at the events of September 11th as an example of American imperialism. It's almost like they thought the United States deserved to be attacked that day. You know, chickens coming home to roost. There's an element of truth in that, but unfortunately, the peace movement really dropped the ball after the events of September 11th came to light. Continuing. Virtually every American would be shocked, if not also awed, by the knowledge that the U.S. government has, since World War II, instigated or otherwise orchestrated not one, two, or a half dozen, but 55 and still counting coups and or raising of sovereign governments in developed nations across the globe. Raising, spelled with a Z. Actually, what's his name? A great intellectual who died just a few months ago. I forget his name, but he estimated that since World War II, there were 72 military interventions. Okay. Since World War II, 72 interventions. Syntax in these matters is of course relevant, as with the semiotic and semantic distinctions to be made between the couplets shock and awe and shock and awe. Okay. We want to get to the stuff that talks about 9/11. Okay, quoting Naomi Klein, another person that refuses to look at the role of 9/11 in establishing American hegemony, tracking the illusionary empiricism within the holographic dilemma. Okay. I'm interested in September 11th. So let's see what else this has to say. You know, I've got this cough because I very rarely get colds, but here the weather's changed. It's got cold, and this has happened. Yeah, so I guess that's it. There's not too much about September 11th, but we can apply it. Look, okay, here we go. Stephen Jones. Notwithstanding a murmur of, who is Stephen Jones? He's a physicist that looked at the rubble and it found nanothermite. Let's go back a little bit. Scores of related and troubling matter within the holographic state would emerge shortly after 9/11, circulating the internet over the past several years, some of which has made its way into published journalistic accounts. They cite Jim Marrs, David Ray Griffin. This non-academic inquiry calls for the rather more prosaic and perhaps also courageous praxis than the imaginative inquiry the 9/11 Commission report so gravely summons. Due diligence that can square, among other disparate claims of facts, the two following strands. Standard public administrative operating procedures, rehearsed, documented, and carried out scores of times each year, with that probabilistically implausible, comprehensive failure of NORAD to respond according to procedure even after the first World Trade Center tower had been hit. Notwithstanding a murmur of published scholarly inquiry, a foreboding silence shrouds these matters across academic venues. Yeah, that's true. Silence that is nowhere more astonishing than in the aftermath of the scholarly due diligence by Brigham Young University physicist Stephen Jones, a hitherto lifelong Republican, voting for George Bush twice, and he lost his job. A well-respected and published material scientist, beloved teacher with no personal history of previous political activism, whose research inquiry into 9/11 reveals indissoluble material evidence from dust samples obtained shortly after the attacks that the towers were imploded and exploded, not pancaked. Jones's inquiry of these samples finds the chemical equivalent of, or thumbprint evidence of the presence of explosive and metal melting compounds throughout the debris at Ground Zero. This article from 2008. Stephen Jones, yes. Thermite. This evidence, combined with extensive and corroborated eyewitnesses' testimony from Ground Zero of rocking explosions prior to and following impacts, as well as undisputed materials science, including the virtual impossibility of diffuse fire substantially diminishing structural steel strength, all powerfully suggest that the World Trade Towers 1, 2, and 7, Building 7, could only have been felled by internally placed explosives administered with extensive access through security clearance with the best demolition expertise available. For his studious efforts and judicious request for peer review of his various inquiry into 9/11 contradicting the official pancake theory of the tower's collapse, Professor Jones eventually found himself compelled to accept an early retirement by Brigham Young University and refused peer review by any extant academic journal. Jones's inquiry into, and that was something that Chomsky always said, where's the peer review? Where's the peer review? Well, who controls the journals? Jones's inquiries into dust samples from 9/11 does not propose any sort of new or controversial science. Rather, Jones calls merely for the application of science where its impartial measure seems so gravely warranted. It is rather the official pancake theory of the tower collapse that whistled up new evidence, claims that ought, therefore, to elicit immediate, scientifically rigorous and peer-reviewed tests of steel tolerances in the interest of public safety around the world. Which is what I've always said, it's the official count that meets the criteria of a conspiracy theory. And no such test meeting the canon of scientific rigor have been anywhere carried out. There will be no dearth of gainsaying the what if and why not disputations about 9/11 into the foreseeable future. The Vice President's comments. Okay. The official commentary on 9/11 reveals glaring gaps and not a few bright line contradictions. But our intentions in this symposium are to step back from these matters to attempt imparting coherence across an arcing holographic drama denoted by quizzical eclipses and grave implications, as which 9/11 poses us. The articles assembled here are intended to delineate the long shadows and also intricate crevices and fissures, denoting current American behavior conditions, dilemmas, and challenges, bearing the imprimatur of still begging trouble questions left by 9/11, but which extend at least as far back as World War II. Like the molecular thumbprint evidence available from Ground Zero, the imprimatur not only of 9/11, but scores of other shocking incidents in the shadow of American world dominance that have proved extraordinarily elusive. And there's been a lot of time recently talking about Oklahoma City and that false flag. I suggest looking at the documentaries that I've placed here about that. What are the political implications? What does it mean for white supremacy, for these demonized groups that have been the change from flavor of the month, Islamic terrorists? What does it mean when we realize that our own government is sitting on top of these terrorist cells, running the operations? We will have to go back to the drawing board and redo all our own theories. Now there's a quote from George Orwell, Empiricism Revisited. You plant intelligentsia. You plaint intelligentsia were the dead. Theirs, the workers' destiny, was the future. But you could share in that future if you kept alive the mind as they kept alive the body, and pass on the secret doctrine that 2 + 2 make 4. Okay, I don't really see the relevance of that. All science requires the parsing of cause and effect, a matter of banal methodological rigor that is the interest of few people outside the cloistered precincts of academic inquiry. Continue reading. The author Lance DeHaven Smith takes up the implications of murky incidents that bear consistent motive and or modus operandi in his peace-giving account of state crimes against democracy, or SCAD. The SCAD heuristic is essentially a framework for developing a unified theory of state criminality, undermining democracy itself. Rather than focusing on individual political crimes and suspect crimes, the SCAD heuristic calls for analysts to look for evict clusters of suspicious incidents that are characterized by similar tactics, targets, beneficiaries, and or synchronous policy consequences. This approach reveals telling patterns in the state political criminality, patterns pointed to plausible actors and institutional vulnerabilities. Next, author Chris Hinson examines SCAD secrecy, drawing lessons from the 3 most thoroughly investigated examples of state political criminality in recent U.S. history. According to Hinson, the United States had developed a complex secrecy framework to govern the classification and declassification of state secrets. However, the effective functioning of this framework depends on the good intentions of public officials at the highest levels. If and when presidents and or vice presidents decide to conspire against popular sovereignty and democratic accountability, secrecy can easily be turned into a device to shield criminality from congressional oversight. Similarly, selective leaking can be used to mislead Congress, independent prosecutors, and the nation. The role of secrecy in Watergate, Iran-Contra, Plamegate demonstrates the urgent need to reform U.S. secrecy laws so that they are less vulnerable to abuse. Probably nobody remembers who Valerie Plame was. It was big news at the time. I propose Adolf Hitler's insight that the grossly impudent lie always leaves traces behind it, even after it has been nailed down. Author Laurie Manuel discusses some of the cognitive constructs that can prevent people from considering evidence of SCADs, specifically in relation to the events of September 11, 2001, and the American-led war on terror in Afghanistan and Iraq. Drawing upon experimental research in terror management theory and system justification theory, Manuel examines how government officials and mainstream media can manipulate mass publics into forfeiting their civil liberties and abrogating their civic duties. Although people often harbor suspicions about the motives of bureaucrats and politicians, most people disregard claims that public officers, public officials in general, especially those at the highest levels, could or would conspire in election tampering, assassinations, mass murder, or other high crimes. These are crimes that are so great that they would undermine the very image of democracy itself. Like she said, election tampering, assassinations, mass murder, or other high crimes. Such claims, Manuel reminds us, are difficult for citizens of those states to comprehend, even when backed by substantial corroborating evidence. The uses by leaders of censorship, suppression of information, imprisonment, and torture to subjugate political opponents are not tactics exclusive to authoritarian states. Elites everywhere have access to and motives for such tactics, as America's many post-World War II clandestine involvements in foreign governments give testament. Yeah, ever heard of Guatemala? Ever heard of El Salvador? Yet theories of political assassinations, terrorist attacks, and other national tragedies that differ from official sanctioned accounts of such events are frequently dismissed by mass publics because they evoke strong cognitive dissonance, emotionally charged cognitions occurring when new ideas and information conflict with previously formed ideologies and accepted beliefs. Such dissonance is the societal residue left lingering following this or that shock and awe. Their persistence of faulty beliefs at both the individual and societal levels probably plays an important psychological function by promoting feelings of safety and justice, including awareness of potential vulnerability and exploitation. By implication, Manuel reasons that social truth and justice movements and reform initiatives need to include strategies for resolving the cognitive dissonance that their claims and proposals inevitably provoke. Wow, that's a totally unexplored and ignored trajectory for the peace movement, which has not wanted to look at false flag terrorism as an operational procedure. Continuing, the mechanisms for channeling and normalizing the dissonance Manuel excavates is matter taken up by authors King Tom and Alexander Kozmin, According to these authors, the war on terror provides an unusual window for seeing real convergence among and between state actors engaged in the largely invisible maneuvering over framing and reframing of anti-terrorism legislation in the United States, Europe, and Australia. A cursory comparative glance at the USA Patriot Act and these other ones around the world, and even Stalinist legislation, reveals a governance convergence toward the use and abuse of the politics of fear. The now essentially irrelevance of habeas corpus and the abolition of double jeopardy, secret and protracted detention and torture, and increasingly geographic prevalence of surveillance technologies across Anglo-American nations has many citizens concerned about the rapidly convergent authoritarian behavior of political oligarchs and actual destruction of sovereignty and democratic values under the onslaught of anti-terrorism hubris, propaganda, and fear. In Australia, the rhetoric of world transformed since 9/11. The war on terror justifies the security apparatus. Wow, they're writing this even before COVID, which is another example of just what they're talking about. Once you start researching these things for yourself, you see they're everywhere. We, of course, live in far less barbaric times, for more amenable to, if not welcoming, of scientific inquiry, whether into September 11th of 1973, which overthrew the democratically elected president of Chile. That's what they're referring to here. 2001 or otherwise. On behalf of the authors here assembled, the guest editors of the symposium wish to thank the American behavioral scientists for hosting this inquiry. And that's true. We live in a time where we can research these things in comparative safety. A lot of people have died who have been 9/11 truth activists, written books, politicians, died under suspicious circumstances, but they're in the minority. For the most part, we can research this because it doesn't affect change. It does on a mass scale because, and that's why they let it go. Of course, whether or not we're affecting change on the community level, which is a realistic goal, that depends on all of us. Now, I didn't read all of this article, every single word I wanted, and I've also given my thoughts, but I think it's very interesting from the point of view of the social sciences, looking at this from a sociological and linguistic point of view. Sense making under holographic conditions, framing SCAD research, state crimes against democracy. So we are indebted to the American behavioral scientists and to the authors that participated in this symposium.